So, Andrew, it really is a great pleasure to have you back. It really is a welcome back to Andrew because he comes back every so often and we're delighted you're here.
Thank you, Pauline. And it's great to be back in ANU. I left Vancouver about 5-6 days ago, and because it's Vancouver and it's this time of year, it's raining and raining and raining. And when I arrived in Canberra on Saturday, it was pouring with rain. But today the weather's absolutely spectacular. Coming around and driving around here and seeing Canberra, as green as it is at this time of year, is also pretty amazing. Pauline filled you in on what it is that we do. If you can see it on the bottom, rather thank our website is www.hsrgroup.org. And all of the graphics I'm going to be showing you today and all of the analysis that I'm going to be talking about today is up there. And in addition, if any of you are interested, we do a daily bulletin called the Human Security News, which is essentially a series of snapshots of human misery, political violence, organised violence around the world, with links to various other stories. Pauline mentioned that. In addition to that, and particularly those of you who are students, we have something called the Human Security Gateway, which is a portal which has a whole range of human security, global security, I don't really care about what people call it, resources, everything from audio-visual stuff through to papers. Everything's online. There's about 30,000 different resources there, and it's pretty useful. And for those of you who are interested in Afghanistan and Pakistan, we have the Afghanistan and Pakistan conflict monitors, which again come out every day with 3 stories, access to reports and data and all the rest of it. So, if you go up into our website and you're interested in any of those things, you can just sign up for the daily bulletins, and you can unsign up for them. You get more of them very quickly as well. I thought I'd talk today about 3 challenges to global security. And as Pauline said, notwithstanding the fact that we've been talking about this for 6 or so years, the Uppsala University, getting less publicity than us, has been talking about it for a longer period. Ted Gurr and the Minority at Risk group have been talking about this for some time. It remains the case today that politicians, by and large, still think things are getting worse. That's not really surprising in one sense, because when you actually think about it, most people get their information about what's happening in the world, not from experiential knowledge. They don't go out and experience it. They get it from the media. And I used to work for the BBC, and I know that a media imperative, if you're doing foreign news, is if it bleeds, it leads. In other words, if there's going to be any political violence involved, then that is going to get the front page. And a war that very, very quietly ends 15 or 20 years later will maybe get a small paragraph, if you're lucky, on a newspaper record like the New York Times on page 19. And so there's a sense in which we're skewed and we don't actually see what's going on. Plus, and this has also been very important, there are no official statistics on the number of wars being waged around the world, how many people are getting killed in them, how many indirect deaths from more exacerbated disease and malnutrition are. It simply isn't there. It's too difficult for the UN to collect that information because nobody can agree, for example, on what it is that constitutes terrorism. The UN has been meeting for 25 years, trying to get an agreed definition. They can't. You might think armed conflict would be easy enough. You go ask the government in somewhere in Africa and say, tell us about that armed conflict that's going on in the north of your country. You'll be told there is no armed conflict. There are a bunch of murderers running around up there killing people. And they don't want to legitimize very often what is political violence by referring to it as an armed conflict. And even if you look at something like refugees, talk to the Chinese about the 300,000 North Korean refugees that are across the border from the north of DPRK, and you will be told there are no refugees. There are 300,000 illegal economic migrants. So you can imagine that if it's impossible to get member states of the UN to agree on definitions of what it constitutes different forms of political violence, and because they think this is extremely sensitive, and because you wouldn't actually trust them if they did provide the figures, it's been very, very difficult. So there's a huge difference between the process that goes on, the collecting information on the Millennium Development Goals, where all governments provide the data on health, gender equity, environmental degradation, etc., and conflict, where no governments collect that information, and if they do collect that information, they won't share it. And so when I was at the UN, it became very, very clear, A, that we needed this because people inside the UN had no idea whether wars were going up or down, and as a consequence of that, they had no idea whether their peacemaking strategies, peacemaking, stopping ongoing wars, or peace-building strategies, preventing wars that stop from starting again, or prevention strategies were having any effect because they didn't have any data. So we decided that there was a need to have a security equivalent to the UN's Human Development Report. It was going to be called the Human Security Report. And that's what we started doing. It took us far, far longer than we had imagined because getting the data is extraordinarily difficult. But when the data came out, it became clear that the patterns of violence that we were seeing around the world were very, very much at odds with the patterns of violence that most people assumed to be the case. So that should actually be the three changes I want to talk about are firstly, that international wars are 80% down since the 1950s. When I say 80% down, I mean that on average there were about 6 international wars a year in the 1950s. Today there's less than 1. High-intensity civil wars are down by about 78% since the end of the Cold War. I wrote this only a little while ago, so if you studying mistakes, I go. Battle fatalities down by about 90% since the 1950s. Now these are pretty extraordinary changes. And unbelievably little has been written about them. That for me has been the most astonishing thing. There is still not a single book being written on the decline, well apart from our report, on the decline of armed conflict since the end of the Cold War. I can't think of a single book that's written about the decline of international wars since the 1950s. People have written a huge amount about the causes of these sorts of wars, but they haven't written very much about how and why they end. So, firstly, and this is a repeat, I guess, trends in interstate war, and by the way, we include anti-colonial struggles in this category. And we do that essentially because an anti-colonial struggle is actually, it is an international war, although it isn't an interstate war. Not only have these gotten a lot fewer, as I mentioned previously, about 80% down since the 1950s, but they're much less deadly. In fact, they're about 80% less deadly than they were previously. So the average international war in the 1950s was much, much deadlier than the average international war today. And there are very, very few of those. Okay, this is the graphic. You can see the red are the anti-colonial conflicts, the blue are the international conflicts, and you can see the decline there is very, very obvious. People are surprised by it, but when they see the data, I think they realize there's no point disputing it. And so the next question would be, well, it's a good thing, but does it really matter that much? And the answer is it matters hugely. Because international wars are the wars that kill by far the most people. They're far more deadly than civil wars. And that's in part because if you go to war internationally, you have to be able to cross a border, you have to be able to project power for long distances, you tend to be able to have heavy conventional weapons and so forth. And if I just go through or show the next graphic, I don't know whether you can see it all that clearly, but the blue line here are the deaths from international wars. And the red line along the bottom are the deaths from civil wars. And the reason, in a sense, that is so interesting is that if you actually look at the number of wars, the number of civil wars goes up like this and then comes down again. And you can see the number of people being killed in civil wars is very, very small. The number of people being killed in international wars is very large. Only one really, really big civil war, that was the Chinese Civil War, that ended in 1949 or 1949. So, obvious question comes up. Why the decline? Interesting thing is, I said previously, it's a question rarely asked. Geoffrey Blaney once wrote, I know he's not a particularly popular figure now, but he wrote a very interesting book on how wars end. And he said that for every 1,000 pages that's written on the causes of war, there's 1 page written on the causes of peace. Now, he had no idea whether that was true or not. I don't think it is true. But the point was that a lot more is written on the causes of war than the causes of peace. So if we're going to try and explain this, this big decline, there's no simple answer. There's no one answer, but there are a series of interrelated factors that sort of cluster together and that, taken together, have had this consequence of pushing the number of wars down. Firstly, the end of colonialism. You'll remember that right at the very beginning of that graph, the majority of wars being fought around the world were anti-colonial conflicts. They were essentially over by the mid-1970s. And the thing about that is they're never coming back again, because there has been a tremendous shift in norms with respect to what sort of war, when going to war is legitimate. It would be inconceivable today if you took a large European country, a powerful European country, that decided, there's a part of Africa that's not very well defended, I think I'll go out and invade and occupy it and call it a colony. It would just be inconceivable, because the norm against colonialism is so strong. And that, I think, is very important. So, the end of colonialism is one of the factors that have driven wars down, but of course it's not the only one, because many of the other wars, in fact the majority of the other wars over that entire period, have been more traditional interstate wars. But we think that that war averseness norm, which means that there will never be any more colonial wars, applies more broadly than to colonial conflicts. In the 19th century, it would have seemed perfectly normal for any state to go out and invade and occupy part of what we now call the developing world. There was no moral opprobrium associated with that. War was simply a neutral instrument of statecraft. If you could get away with it, good for you, and if you didn't, you didn't. That has really changed. In fact, since the Second World War, there are only 2 circumstances when it's legitimate to go to war. One is in self-defense, that's very obvious, and the other one is with the authority of the Security Council. And that, in a sense, is a new norm. And even the United States feels obliged to address that norm. Even the United States spent an enormous amount of political capital trying to get the international community, trying to get the Security Council in particular, to agree that it was appropriate, legitimate, and get the UN stamp of approval for invading Iraq. They failed. Now, the fact that norms are breached doesn't mean to say they aren't important. We all know that the incest taboo is a very important norm, but it's breached very, very frequently. So it's one factor. And then there's nuclear weapons. And I don't think anybody would doubt that with respect to the relationships between the major powers, nuclear weapons engendered a very real degree of caution in that relationship. And it meant, in a sense, that going to war between the major powers, particularly the nuclear powers, no longer had any conceivable strategic purpose. So nuclear weapons helped preserve the peace during the Cold War years. It was an extremely dangerous way of doing it, because if there was ever going to be a mistake, then the consequences would be catastrophic. But that's really all. Kenneth Waltz once argued that countries that had nuclear weapons were the countries that were at peace. Countries that didn't have nuclear weapons were the countries that tended to go to war. That is, in fact, completely wrong. When you actually think about it for a moment, the countries that have been involved in more wars than any others since the end of World War II are, in this order, France, Great Britain, the United States, and Russia, the former Soviet Union. In other words, 4 out of the 5 nuclear weapon states have fought more wars than any other international war than any other country in the world. So nuclear weapons certainly didn't stop that. And in addition, nuclear weapons turned out to be not such a good deterrent either. Because if you actually think about it, the US possession of nuclear weapons didn't stop the Chinese entering the Korean War and fighting with American forces there. They didn't deter the Vietnamese from fighting a war against the United States. British nuclear weapons didn't deter the Argentinians in 1982. Soviet nuclear weapons never deterred the Afghans when they were fighting the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So we have lots of evidence to suggest that this just isn't a terribly useful explanation for the decline in armed conflicts. It may be an explanation for, part of the explanation for the absence of war between the superpowers, although John Buller makes a very powerful argument that since World War II, just using conventional weapons until the very end, the overwhelming majority of deaths were as consequence of conventional weapons. Maybe 50 or 60 million people died. That's a big enough deterrent to avoid wanting to start another big conventional war again. Then we have the democratic peace argument, which I'm sure you've all heard of. The argument is that no two democracies have ever gone to war against each other. And then if you're careful, you say, democracies have only extremely rarely gone to war against each other, because there's an argument about Finland and Russia in World War II. So there's always going to be arguments at the margin. But by and large, it holds pretty well. And we've seen it more than tripling in the number of democracies since the end of the Cold War. In fact, the number of democracies, according to the Polity 4 scale, which is the one that's most commonly used by political scientists, has increased by, I think it is 180% since the end of the Cold War alone. So that's a factor as well. And then there's the end of the Cold War. And what the end of the Cold War did, like the end of colonization did, it removed from the international system an extremely important form of conflict. So you have all of those benign, all of those processes which have all sorts of consequences, but one of the benign consequences they have is to reduce the risk of international wars. And then finally I have up there globalization. What do I mean by that? I mean essentially increasing economic interdependence, whether it's measured in terms of the share of trade you have as part of your international trade, as part of your GDP, or whether it is a measure of economic interdependence measured in terms of cross-investment, foreign direct investment. Really interesting work being done by Eric Garza at the University of California, San Diego, and he's now making the argument what he calls the capitalist peace is actually more powerful force, a more powerful way of reducing the risk of war than is the democratic peace. And the essential argument about the interdependence argument is that the greater degree of interdependence you have in the system, the greater the incentive that states in that system have to avoid going to war, which would destroy the economic links that make them rich. And I think it's a pretty interesting and pretty compelling explanation. Just go down and see what we have next. Okay, next question. So this is a benign pattern, any new risks. Are any of those risk factors that I've talked about likely to depart, stop, or reverse in the near future, again rising up the risks? Well, as I said previously, Cold War and colonialism, they're not coming back again. Globalization, measured in terms of increased international trade and foreign direct investment, is almost certainly going to increase. It's been increasing steadily for the past 60 years. There's been a 200% increase in the number of democracies since the end of the Cold War. So it doesn't look as though there are going to be many real challenges to that, but we can of course never be sure. So now I want to turn to civil wars. And in turning to civil wars, these are actually wars of all types, but you can see that the majority in here, the red patch, are civil wars. The little green line along the bottom here are the anti-colonial wars. The yellow over here are interstate wars. And you can see they've always been, even though they're very deadly, a very small percentage of the whole. And then up here, you've got this blue lot. And they're what we call, it's a horrible term, internationalized intrastate conflicts. That really basically means a civil war in which there are outside powers involved, but not fighting against the state. So, example, Afghanistan, Iraq. Not Afghanistan when the United States invades after 2011, but Afghanistan after when the United States is partnering, so-called, with the government of Afghanistan. And you can see that there's this extraordinary increase in the number of conflicts up until the end of the Cold War. This, by the way, is a period some historians call the long peace, without any sense of irony. So the number of wars doubles in this period, but they refer to it as the long peace. And it isn't actually that stupid, because they're talking about major power wars, and the really interesting thing about this period is that there have been no major power wars. And this is the longest period in which there have been no major power wars in literally hundreds and hundreds of years. So that's good news as well. But this is the really interesting bit. End of the Cold War, and blam, you see this huge decline, and then kick back up again. Now, I've only got I should explain here that a war is defined as a conflict in which 25 or more, armed conflict is defined as one in which there are 25 or more battle-related deaths. It's a pretty low threshold. And when you see this increase over here, which many people who follow our stuff have been getting very, things have changed. The benign trend has been reversed. Well, it's only gone on for about 4 years, and that doesn't mean very much. But much more importantly, all of this increase over here is in minor conflicts. If you look at high-intensity conflicts, those in which 1,000 or more people are killed a year, you'll find there's obviously a smaller number of them. They've come up. They've been going down, and they're now down to about 70%. Sorry, 80%, 78% of what they were previously. So the decline is actually the important part of the decline is actually much, much greater than it appears to be there. So, other risks. Was this part? I think this was actually when I was talking about interstate war. I've got my slides in the wrong direction. It's actually Pauline's fault, because she said I was starting at 10:30, and I haven't actually finished putting this thing together. So I think this has to do with, this bit up here had to do with risk of future international war. Although in the case of Islamist radicalism, it is both international and international. In other words, is Islamist radicalization likely to spark new numbers of interstate wars? We think unlikely, because the radical Islamist ideology is losing support throughout the Muslim world. There is and even in Pakistan and Afghanistan, support for the extreme ideology is extraordinarily low. And where you do find Islamist groups that have a considerable amount of popular support, Hezbollah, Hamas, Brotherhood, it's nearly always because of their welfare policies and not their ideology. Where the radical Islamist groups, like Al-Qaeda, have had positions of local power, they have not done what the groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and Brotherhood have done, which is to provide humanitarian assistance, educational assistance, social welfare programs, and so forth. And the reason that means that organizations like Al-Qaeda do not have, they have a bunch of small fanatical followers. They do not have a mobilized mass base. They don't have a mobilized mass base because their ideology is seen as repulsive and repellent by a majority of Muslims, and therefore they don't have the support base that you need to have a people's war. And people's war, as we've seen in Vietnam and China, can be very successful. So if you lack legitimacy, you lack support, you can't have a people's war. The only other way you can win is to have a conventional army. None of these groups have an effective conventional army. So, and I think we're very careful not to predict the future, but just to say it is difficult to think that many than a tiny handful of Islamist organizations are ever going to be able to seize power in the foreseeable future. And I'll leave it just like that. Now I want to talk about, I came to Australia. I'm sitting watching late line the other night, and I hear one distinguished academic, former official, another one former academic, former official, standing and talking about the China threat. And I think, wow, that's, we're looking out to 2030. We can't be sure. We need to buy huge numbers of new guns, bombs, and tanks because this threat is looming out there. And That's strange. That debate goes on in parts of the US defense establishment. You'd expect that. The US defense establishment needs to have a serious adversary in order to be able to maintain the force structure that it has. But in Australia, Canada, there's no debate like this. And the interesting question, it seemed to me, and these people were never asking themselves, and worse still, the BBC interview was not asking, why would China ever want to challenge the United States militarily when A, it's relatively, really weak compared to the United States, and B, it has far more powerful economic weapons that it can and does use. You don't have to believe that China is a benign power in any sense to believe that it's a power that may not want to exert its power through military means. And the most important point there, I think, is that China has a huge economic stake in the stability of the present system. So when I read that the Chinese are buying this and the Chinese are buying that, and we should be very worried about this, I think, this is a country where the GDP is growing at 9% a year. The military is a large part of the bureaucracy, and any large, powerful bureaucracy wants to make sure that it maintains its share of the cake. So it's almost, I don't know what the figures are, but I would guess that the military budget is being raised at about the same rate as the rate of growth. And that means they're getting a huge amount of money, new money every year, and they've got to spend it on something. So they buy stuff. And the fact that you're buying stuff doesn't necessarily mean you want to go to war with someone. The other interesting thing is that if you actually think about China, China used to be a country that supported a lot of leftist insurgent movements in Southeast Asia, and sometimes to a lesser degree further afield. In 1979, that had just about stopped. 1979, China had its border war with Vietnam, a kind of stupid war. And since then, it has done nothing like that. Since then, the Chinese have focused on economic power, political influence, joining regional organizations. The Chinese are now a major contributor to the United Nations in terms of peacekeeping forces. So I just wanted to say that in passing, and I don't move quickly on. Oh, wait a minute. I've talked about Kuwait. Anyway, I can never remember if I've actually put these things up or not. Okay, so this is to give you some idea of just how important East and Southeast Asia was in terms of people being killed. If you look at the graph which I'll show you later, you'll see that nearly everybody in the world being killed up until the end of the 1970s was being killed in East and Southeast Asia. So you have the Chinese Civil War, you have the Korean War, you have the Wars of National Liberation, and this is basically here is Indochina. And when the time you get down to here, the 1991, then there's 1979. This is the China's border war, and then after that it's just coming down and down and down and down and down and down and down. And I think if you look at the number of battle deaths in these relatively small guerrilla struggles that are going on today, they're somewhere in the region of 400 to 600, 700. Whereas over here, you had a huge number. In fact, the actual number of battle deaths in 1950 was, I think it was about 350,000. So an enormous change within this region. One of the chapters in our book, in our report, is called The New Peace in Asia. Okay, what about civil wars? This is what I remember I showed you the graph of civil wars up there. Those two last slides were out of context. Civil wars are really interesting because they kept on proliferating throughout the Cold War, and then you don't see any decline until the Cold War. Then the end of the Cold War comes and suddenly everything changes. It is just remarkable on any sort of indicator that does to do with global security, you would see extraordinary changes. And I said there you see a big decline, and I noticed up there again the decline is only in minor conflicts, and the ones that really matter have continued to go down. So here's the graph again. And you can see that these internationalized and intrastate conflicts that are up here, they kill a lot more people, not surprisingly. If you have a foreign power involved in a civil war, your death rate always tends to go up. The increase is pretty steady over here, and it's pretty steady down here as well. And when people challenge this, they'll say, "Oh, it's just a temporary blip." And then you have to sit there and figure out how many years have to go by before it ceases to be a temporary blip and actually becomes a trend. And we think that that's certainly no doubt there is a trend in that. Okay, why the decline? End of the Cold War. As with the international conflicts, the end of the Cold War takes out from the international system a source of ideological and political hostility. But that's not all. What the end of the Cold War also does, it means that neither the Russians nor the Americans have any real incentive to keep on providing resources to insurgent groups in what used to be called proxy wars. In the old days, it made sense to try and fight. Every little country was a pawn in the great game of international conflict between East and West. And it was mostly the Americans that backed up regimes, and mostly the Soviets that backed up resistance to those regimes. And we figure that probably at the end of the Cold War, pulling those resources out means that it can account for about 20% of the wars that stop, no more. There's a second argument, which is rising incomes, or rather, what the impact of rising incomes is simply an indicator, a proxy indicator, for state capacity. And as incomes rise, the argument goes, incomes rise, you have greater state capacity, you have greater state capacity because states can tax more, so they have more resources. They can use those resources to buy off grievances, to create, try and buy off whole political groups, or they can use those resources to crush armed resistance. The rebels, on the other hand, tend to live out in the periphery of the country. They don't benefit from rising incomes the same way, and as a consequence of that, over a period of time, the balance of power in countries in civil wars is moving inexorably towards governments and away from rebel groups. Now, sometimes rebel groups will have access to external sources of revenue. It could be drugs, as is the case in Afghanistan. It could be timber, as was the case in Cambodia. It could be guns, as is the case in Sierra Leone. As a general rule, the balance of power is moving against insurgents in most civil wars. In fact, when we looked at East and Southeast Asia, we found that there hadn't been a single insurgent victory in the region. You can argue about Timor, but there's basically not a single insurgent victory in the region since the mid-1970s. In the Middle East and North Africa, also a region with relatively strong, quote-unquote, states, there have been not a single insurgent victory again since 1975, and that one victory was in Yemen. And the really interesting thing is that what you've actually seen now are popular non-violent struggles bringing regimes down. And that the strategic studies community hasn't looked at very seriously, and that I think has been a major mistake. In fact, if you actually look at the data, you'll see that since 1985, there's been a 70% decline in the number of authoritarian regimes around the world. And in almost none of those cases were those regimes toppled as a consequence of violent domestic insurrections. They either sort of gave up or they succumbed to people power, the sorts of things we've been seeing going on in the Middle East. And that, we think, is another very encouraging trend. Rising incomes, and then we had another shift in global norms, and this was a shift in global norms that were associated with the end of the Cold War. We have the democratic peace thesis for interstate wars has a complement for civil war that's called the democratic civil peace. And what this means is that as countries become inclusively democratic, the risk of war declines quite radically. In fact, if you actually look, we have the Policy 4 data set has 3 types of governance regime: authoritarian, democratic, and then in the middle, so-called anocracies. Regimes that are neither fully democratic nor fully authoritarian, but an unstable mix of the two. And so what you find is that authoritarian regimes are about 3 times the risk of conflict compared with democratic regimes. Anocracies are about 6 times the risk, and then democracies have they're at a much lower risk. And so you have a slightly paradoxical situation where, as you becoming a democracy, if you can become a democracy, the risk of war falls. But getting to being a democracy means the risk of war increases. But now, of course, democracy is an established global norm. Even reactionary regimes, even authoritarian regimes, call themselves democracies. Egypt had elections on a regular basis, so does Syria and other countries, because there is a norm out there. Democracy is the most respectful way of doing things. So that was one shift in global norms that we think has been important. And the second one comes from the minorities at rights group. And it's really interesting. What they found in minority rights was, at the end of the Cold War, the level of political discrimination directed by governments against minority groups dropped by about half. Still don't know why. But again, we think it has something to do with changing norms. And as that level of political discrimination dropped by half, the number of self-determination conflicts went down by 40%. Again, this is correlation, not cause, and we have to be a little bit careful, but it's something we think is, again, well worth looking at. And finally, human rights. There's been a big shift in prosecutions of human rights abuses. Prior to the end of the Cold War, there was a culture of impunity. No matter what you did, if you were a political leader, if you tortured people, if you incarcerated them without trial, you weren't, even if you were overthrown, nothing much was going to happen. You could go out, like Idi Amin did after killing hundreds of thousands of Ugandans, and spend the rest of your life very comfortably in Saudi Arabia. That's beginning to change. Prior to the end of the Cold War, there were virtually no human rights prosecutions. Subsequent to the end of the Cold War, they have just exploded. And the ones you hear about, the ad hoc tribunals, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, and the Balk and Yugoslavia, they are important. ICC has not been enough around for them to make it. The really important ones are the national prosecutions against human rights abuses. And what a new paper out by Catherine Sicking and a young Korean number cruncher shows that as this level of human rights prosecutions has risen, the number of human rights abuses has fallen. So that is interesting in itself and of itself, but what is also interesting is that human rights abuses are a very good predictor of civil war. And as you'll see, that if you see a sharp increase in abuses of core human rights, political integrity rights, that is also associated with big risk with that. So these are a number of processes that have been happening. This isn't really about particular policy initiatives that are taken to try and stop wars. And what I want to do finally is to talk about those, to talk about the explosion of international activism that we've seen on this front. Okay. So, since the end of the Cold War, what happened at the end of the Cold War, the UN was just liberated. It was allowed to do all sorts of things it could never ever have done during the Cold War itself. And that meant preventive diplomacy, but not so much as that. It meant peacemaking, intervening with mediators to try and stop ongoing wars, and it meant post-conflict peace building, which was really a form of nation building, and that was really about, from a security point of view, preventing wars that had stopped from starting again. And the figures on this, we see a 300% increase in peacekeeping missions, a doubling in the number of troop committing countries, and that's over a period of 20 years. A 500% increase in the number of special representatives of the Secretary General, the best single indicator we have of UN security activism in the field, because these are the guys who run peacemaking operations, peacekeeping operations, and so forth. A 33-fold increase in the number of groups like Friends of the Secretary General or contact groups. These are groups that form, come together to help a particular country that's in conflict to get out of conflict, and once it's out of conflict, to help it get back onto its feet again and reduce the risk. And then finally, a 9-fold increase in disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration missions, and a 4-fold increase in sanctions. And no matter what indicator you look at for international activism, you'll find they're all the same, 300 to 1,000+% increases. Now, what we know about a lot of these things, UN sanctions, for example, arms embargoes have a success rate And by success, they don't mean complete success, they made a positive difference of only 25%. Kind of pathetic. UN peacekeeping operations, in terms of the most important indicator, which is did a war start again within 5 years after the peacekeeping mission, about 60% success rate. 60% is not bad, but it's certainly not great. And no matter which one of these things you look at, whether it's DDR operations, you'll find the same thing. Not a very high success rate. And that's why people can point at the UN and say, you people are failing all the time. Think Rwanda, think Somalia, think Bosnia, Srebrenica. Failure, 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 failure. And that's what the story is. And it's true that there have been those failures. But even if the UN was only succeeding, say, 30% of the time, that would be 30% of successes that were never happening during the Cold War years because they weren't being tried. And so our point to the, essentially to the critics of the UN is to say, look, they really have made a difference. And they've made a difference notwithstanding the fact that they've got or had really inappropriate mandates, inadequate resources, and hideous politics. So imagine if you had a situation where you had adequate resources, appropriate mandates, and less really awful politics. It would make a big difference. Finally, the decline in the deadliness of warfare. I've talked about the number of conflicts thus far, but in a sense what matters in human terms is the number of people who get killed in these conflicts. And here again, you can see there's been a huge decline. Average war in the 1950s killed about 10,000 people a year. In the new millennium, the figure is around 1,000. So it's again been an extraordinary change. Still too many wars, but they don't kill nearly as many people. And this is a graph showing the average number of battle deaths per conflict by decade. By battle deaths, we include combatants getting killed and civilians getting killed in the crossfire. We do not include intentional killing of civilians, a la Rwanda, genocides and plebiscides. We have a separate data set for that. And this also doesn't tell us about what we call non-state conflicts. Non-state conflicts are those in which a state isn't involved as one of the warring parties. It's a conflict between warlords or rebel groups or intercommunal conflicts. And there are quite a lot of those, but they kill very, very few people and they don't last very long at all. This is just to give you an idea, instead of doing it by bar chart, bar graphics. This is to give you an idea in regional terms who's been doing all the killings. We remember we said previously East and Southeast Asia, that's this bit over here. You can see a huge amount of killing going on over there. Then over here you have Middle East and North Africa. Actually, you see the colours. Yeah, Middle East and North Africa here. And then at the bottom you have Sub-Saharan Africa. You can see the last big spike was in Sub-Saharan Africa at basically the second half of the 1990s. And that was the wars in the Great Lakes, and it was Ethiopia, Eritrea. And now we're down over here, and this little bit over here is basically Iraq. Big controversies about the number of people killed in Iraq. We think that the epidemiological studies that were done that got all the publicity, 600,000 killed, are quite wrong. The real figures probably between somewhere like 120, 150, 180,000. But nobody can prove that. But even if you accepted, the very, very high figure, it would still only go up a little bit like this, because that's a figure for a whole period of years. Okay. So then the question again is, obviously, why? Why has there been this decline? Because it's separate from the reason for the decline in the numbers of conflict. First of all, changing nature of warfare. It used to be the case in the Cold War years, where a large number of wars, which were fought because the stakes were very high, it was an East-West conflict, a large number of wars that were fought with extremely large armies, 1 million, 2 million strong sometimes, armed with heavy weapons, we're talking tanks, long-range artillery, bombers, and so forth, with long-range power projection capacities as well. And those heavy weapons, the ones that are really bombardments of cities, kill huge numbers of people. What you tend to find today is that the average war tends to be fought by a small developing country army against an even smaller guerrilla group armed the guerrillas with small arms and light weapons. RPGs were probably the biggest things that they had. And they are very nasty, they kill lots of civilians, but their death tolls are really small because they don't have the heavy weapons that we saw in the Vietnam War, Chinese Civil War, Korean War, and so forth. The other reason for that is that the age of huge military intervention is over. Saw that very, very clearly in East and Northeast Asia. You still have the United States intervening when its perceived national interests at stake, Vietnam and Afghanistan being the two obvious examples. But even there, the level of violence, appalling though it's been, has been way less than the peak years of Vietnam or Korea or whatever. You know, some of you may have read that the deadliest war since World War II has been in the DRC, the Congo. 5.4 million people have died. Mostly people have died from war-exacerbated disease and malnutrition. That is crap. The deadliest war by a long stretch was the Korean War. And we've gone through and looked at the data on the DRC and the epidemiological studies that came up with those findings are, to put it mildly, deeply flawed. And we think the true figure is probably, but no one really knows, less than half that. Okay, finishing off. What else has caused the reduction in deaths? Peacetime health interventions save lives in wartime. If you look at what's been happening over the past 30 years, I just tell you that one of the most statistics that really amazed us when we were working through this was that we found, if you look at under 5 mortality rate, which is the best data that we have, but we know that the adult mortality rate is the same. If you looked at under 5 mortality rate, we found that in 90% of years in which countries were in war around the world, the child mortality rate improved. How is it the case that your child mortality rate can, I mean, wars cause more people to die, but here's the child mortality rate going down? Anybody can figure an answer to that?
More food?
There's
more food?
Yeah. More food is sort of more better living standards, and so people were better able to take the shocks of war, but above all, immunization. So immunization meant a whole range of killer diseases that would shoot up in wartime when people came to place, simply weren't killing people anymore. And the last thing that we point out there is humanitarian assistance. Again, since the end of the Cold War, the level of humanitarian assistance has gone up by at least 300% per person that's displaced, and we think the number of people displaced are the best indicator of the human costs of war. And it's become a lot more efficient. So, for example, where it used to be the case that feeding kids was a really, really expensive, difficult operation, you brought them into camps, and they had these, they fed them milk with supplements, they're now given plumpy nut. And plumpy nut are these little tubes, so it's a sort of a peanut-based paste with all sorts of supplements in. They take them home, they rip the top off, they squeeze it, the kids love it, and they regain their weight extraordinarily quickly, and it's saving large numbers of lives. Okay, looking forward. I think if we're looking forward 20 or 30 years, we find incomes are still going to be rising in the developing world. Incomes are rising in the developing world today faster than they've ever been rising previously. 6 out of the top 10 countries in terms of rates of economic growth are in sub-Saharan Africa, the basket case area. And that's going to mean that governments are going to become stronger. Governance is going to get more effective. And as that happens, that's one of the very best indicators for seeing profits going down. We're also winning fewer wars. I mentioned that previously, and that's part of the reason for that. The big question mark coming down the road, probably not just yet, there's been a few studies suggesting that global warming is already having an impact on increasing the risk of war. They're mostly econometric studies, which are kind of dubious, to put it mildly. But climate change is clearly, 20 or 30 years from now, going to be a huge challenge. And we don't see very many signs that governments are thinking seriously enough about it. And I will stop there with just this picture, because I've been talking about statistics the whole time. And this is a pretty amazing picture. This is a 14-year-old, 13-year-old Liberian child soldier who was just shot at the photographer who took the picture. The photographer left very quickly after that, as you can imagine. And, oh, sorry. What is interesting about it is you can see what he has on his back. It's got a teddy bear backpack. And that's part of the concept. When we've been talking about something which is in some sense an optimistic story. But the reality is that for the people that aren't part of the optimistic story, the ones that still are involved as child soldiers or survival sex workers or anything like that in conflict zone, it's still pretty awful. And I'll stop there.
Okay, any thoughts or reactions and comments, questions? Anna? Yes?
Andrew, Mark Angel from National Security College. 2 questions, if I may, about your methodology in the decline. I know you use absolute numbers. Have you considered the fact that relativity, the relative lethality, fewer participants, but the casualty rates amongst the participants, what sort of observations did you get from that? And secondly, in terms of your analogy about the number of people killed, for example, in Korea, the Chinese Civil War, and Vietnam, compared to these sorts of discrimination available for targeting that. In Vietnam, if you wanted to hit an insurgent, you had to carpet bomb many miles of jungle, villages, and so forth to hit one. Now you can track him with a drone and with precision instruments, drop a bomb on him, fewer collateral damages. So the relative effect of increased discrimination and precision in the lethality, and what impact that's had on the overall numbers.
Could you just repeat your first question?
First one, fewer people participating, and an analysis of the numbers of participants versus the number of casualties. Because when you have mass armies, as we had in the era of conscription in the 50s and 60s, as opposed to all volunteer forces, increased lethality amongst smaller number of people.
Yeah. Okay. I think the answer to that is if you look at modern militaries, particularly in the United States, you see that the number of people that die from injuries has been shrinking steadily. Well, it's shrinking steadily since World War II, and that's very, very low. And that seems to be the best single reason for that is that they get people out very, very quickly, because most people die because they're weak to death, even though wouldn't have been a life-threatening injury. But that, of course, really only applies to countries where you've got high-tech warfare going on. The overwhelming majority of wars aren't like that, so I don't think it makes a great deal of difference there. It will make a difference in the Iraqs and the Afghanistans, but not that. And then the interesting point, it's one being made, obviously been made before, is that we now have the ability to discriminate. We can go in, we can and look at the percentage of smart munitions that are used from war to war. It's just been going up like this. And that's true, and that really does make a difference. And the fact that if you're fighting in Iraq, you actually have to get permission from a lawyer, before you target something that may be civilian. Having said that, I think that the reason it's so difficult to win these wars is that it's very, very difficult for counterinsurgent groups to protect themselves against IEDs and snipers and things like that. And what really matters in terms of these wars is not whether you are winning tactically on the ground, and I would be killing, the body count is much, much less than yours. But even if your body count is relatively small, what counts is what is the impact of, say, Americans or Canadians or Australians getting killed, shipped back home in green plastic bags on popular support for the war. And the thing that makes every one of these counterinsurgency operations with external powers involved has been the killer for the external power, has always been the drop in popular support for Trump. Canada has gone down like this, in Europe it's gone down like this, the US has gone down. I think it's gone down a bit in Australia, but not as much. But you haven't had many people killed. Canadians have a huge number killed relative to the size of the force they put out there, so the Brits. And that seems to me to be the really critical thing as far as counterinsurgency is concerned.
Hi, my name is Chelsea. I'm from Vancouver as well. I study human security under Professor Brian Job. I have two quick questions about the human security process. One is, what do you feel are the strategic advantages or disadvantages about being and doing your research in Vancouver as opposed to somewhere else in Canada, dare I say Toronto or Ottawa, or somewhere else in the world? And the second is, what is your experience under the Harper Conservative government doing this research when they have eliminated the words human security from their vocabulary?
Yeah, and the Harper government, for those that don't know, shortly after it came in, decided there were some words that were politically incorrect, or politically correct. They didn't want to be politically correct. So terms like international humanitarian law, gender equity, child soldiers, and human security were words that foreign affairs officials were not allowed to use. We lost our funding from them. We actually got more funding back from the STAR program, which is the program that deals primarily at the moment with Afghanistan. But that was because it was the funding was for the Afghanistan conflict monitor, and that didn't have the word human security in it. I don't think, is it a disadvantage being in Vancouver? If you're doing something like, yeah, in a sense it is. It would be, it's a much more of an advantage if we were going to be in New York, but then who wants to live in New York? I certainly don't. And Vancouver, it was a place for us. We had a project and some money in 2001, and Vancouver had space, which was the Liu Institute, and where Lloyd Axworthy was the director. And one of the reasons I think that the present government got so pissed off with human security was that Lloyd, once he left, wrote a series of incendiary op-eds blasting the government on their failure to do this, that, and the other, and all the rest of it. And they associated him with human security. He was the director of our institute, and that didn't help either. And what was your... Did I answer your two questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Christian.
Hi, Christian Enmark, National Security College. Kind of related to the previous question, why particularly does your report need to be called the Human Security Report? Would it not be more accurate to describe it as the Wars and Politically Violent Deaths Report? Isn't it the case that a lot of people conceive this term, Lloyd Axworthy perhaps included, as being much broader, and that your report, although that it measures the number of wars and the number of deaths, does not in fact measure the quantum of human suffering going on in the world, which can be non-deadly in nature?
Yeah. Now, very good question. And when we launched our report, somebody came up and said, how dare you call it the Human Security Report? You could call it a Human Security Report. You can't go. In other words, we would argue we would be gatekeepers and so forth. It's a long debate that's been going on. And the broad proponents of the broad concept of human security say, look, now what we should be concerned about, first of all, everybody agrees it's about threats to the individuals. Right? So it's not about, we make a distinction. Traditionally, security was about protecting borders from foreign threats. Human security is about protecting individuals, and some people want to include communities in that as well. And the reason for that is that the traditional security paradigm, which was state-centered, didn't really take into account that in the last 100 years, far more people have been killed by their own governments than have been killed by foreign armies. And if you are going to have, and you can make an argument that traditional security protects civilians, and it's supposed to, that's supposed to be one of the things that it does, but often it doesn't. Human security is about, its central focus is on civilians. We don't get into these debates, but I'll just tell you my take on this. Broad concept of human security says there are a whole range of things that kill far more people than do wars. Disease, way more. Traffic accidents, more. And we should, they don't actually keep, they say that anything that is responsible for mass death ought to be, of individuals, ought to be a part of the human security agenda. And so, and then some people want to include environmental damage. The Japanese wanted to bring in the idea of affronts to personal dignity as a human security. And so you actually finished up with this thing that was like this, where you had the Holocaust and nuclear war at one end, and affronts to personal dignity on the other. And it was supposed to be a concept. It was completely useless. And the other thing was that within that, undifferentiated human, this is human insecurity, were things that you really wanted to look at and look at the relationships between them. And if you're assuming it's all the same thing, then you can't do that. And so what we say is, if we get into that, is to use the sort of social science language, our dependent variable is organised violence. Political violence, organised violence. But we're interested in the determinants of that, which may have to do with health, education, development, and we're interested in the consequences of that. And what we would actually say is that human insecurity is it's like a syndrome of a disease. There's a whole series of symptoms that tend to cluster together, bads, if you like. So bad governance, poverty, injustice, and so forth. So we share with the broad concept people the idea that this is an interrelated package. And of course, governments are thinking about this too, because when governments are now talking about joined up government in the case of the UK, in Canada it's the 3 Ds, disarmament, development and diplomacy, doesn't do it all, but they're recognising that these things are interrelated. Now from our point, you could just as easily have taken development as your dependent variable and then looked at the impact of conflict on development. So we think that doing this is something that enables us to talk to the development people. We do a lot of work with econometricians now, and they are the people that are looking at the interrelationships between all of these factors. But when everyone else wants to, can we have a debate about broad versus narrow human security? Please, it's too boring. I mean, we say what we do. We don't. It would probably have been more sensible if we called our report global security rather than human security. One thing is that in the developing world, the concept of human security sounds a little bit like human rights, humanitarian intervention, West against the rest, you guys sticking another set of values onto us. Does that answer your question?
That's fine, thank you.
We've just been to a conference in Melbourne partly on this issue of conceptualising human security. So what came out of that? Was there anything?
Nothing much.
Okay.
Could you actually sort of use your data or whatever and then argue that in sort of the conventional idea of security, which was very much military based one, does not deal with the kind of major security threat, which involves the food security or resource security, especially. So think about the sort of shift the resource to manage the sort of all these sort of major new challenges, which would be much more bigger from this conventional military kind of focus to be more so that the money can be in that.
That is one of the arguments very often used by people who, there's an advocacy argument for the broad concept of human security, which is, if it's the case that we're spending $1.5 trillion a year on the military, which is about what we're spending worldwide, and it doesn't appear to be the case that a huge amount of that expenditure has led to the diminution of war, because most of the things that we see as having reduced the incidence of war have not been military. They've been non-military. And so you could say, well, we take some of that 1.5 trillion and we could deliver that to food security, and if you want to say increase levels of immunization and so forth, we know will have a big payoff in terms of saving lives. And I think that's true, but we don't want to talk about that because, and the reason for that is that we had a pragmatic reason for doing what we're doing and not getting to the broad concept. And that is that we don't know anything about food security. I mean, if people ask me what can we do to feed people better in Africa, I'd sort of say, dams, fertilizer, and GMOs. But then I get really unpopular with a lot of my friends who think all of those things are really bad, so I'll shut up about that. And again, do we want to talk about health issues? We have a World Health Organization that brings out a report every year. We're not going to be second-guessing them. World Bank brings out the World Development Report. The UN has its Human Development Report. We wanted to find a niche where we were doing something that nobody else was doing. And recognizing that that is just a purely pragmatic reason. Not saying, and I want to say, I actually think disease is a much, much more serious threat to human security in that broad sense than war is today, because we know that it kills far more people. And it kills them in very painful and awful ways.
John Carrington, I'm to the Centre for Applied Philosophy and Apologetics. So you might have touched on this, but in fact you did when you started saying that look, casualties in war, survival rates of soldiers have become better. So why did you decide to use violent death as the metric and not something like disability adjusted life year lost because of violent death or violent causes?
The data is too crappy to do that. I mean, we've looked at that, but it piles assumption on assumption. There's a very really interesting. What's the acronyms for them? Disability adjusted DALYs. Yeah. There's a really it's a really good point. The costs of war, not just people dying. In fact, people that just die are not as big a cost of war to a government as people that don't die, but are disabled for the rest of their lives. So the disability adjusted life year is one way of trying to get some measure of the total human cost of conflict. Short answer is the data is too awful to do that. There are very, very few ways you can get a good. When we brought out our first report, I wanted to have one of those little warning signs on the front that said, we have the best data in the world, and then it sucks. Because we're fairly confident that the broad trends that we show are correct. But if you say, are you absolutely confident there were 165,423 deaths in that year? No, we've got huge confidence intervals around those figures. Going down the DALYs track would be great if you had the data, but that data is got to come from surveys. It's come from demographic health surveys, and it's coming from WHO World Health surveys and UNICEF surveys. And they're dodgy too. It's not that when the things that go out and measure deaths, like the famous studies that were done in Iraq and in the DRC, and that's a methodology which is being used to detect deaths from disease. Now the thing about diseases is if you have an epidemic, it tends to be spread, not evenly, but it tends to be spread. If you have a war, you have pockets of violence that are very, very concentrated. And in most wars, something like 85% of the countryside is not directly affected at all. So the survey that's good at picking up something which is diffuse is really bad at picking up something which is concentrated. And in order to do that, you need to have sample sizes which are probably 10 times bigger, and no one can afford that. So we think that these surveys are incredibly important. We would love to have the DALYs data. There have been some work done with them by Bruce Russett. We cite that in our last report. But it's dodgy. It's very dodgy. And so we tend to. The other thing is, I think we're pretty sure that indirect deaths, by which we will deaths from war-exacerbated disease and malnutrition, have actually shrunk to a greater degree than direct deaths because of these peacetime health interventions which have reduced wartime death rates from disease and because of humanitarian assistance. If you can actually get refugees to a humanitarian camp, then within between 4 and 6 months, their mortality rate is actually better than it was in the pre-war situation. So humanitarian assistance makes a huge difference, and there was very, very little of it in those wars in the 70s and 60s and 50s.
It's Jonathan Goodall from a visiting fellow here at SOAS. Thanks for a very, very interesting presentation. I have a couple of very related questions. One is about the most controversial part of your story, I think, is about the way you attribute the decline to one of the main factors behind international intervention. And I'd like if you could say a little bit more about the data you draw on and the kind of causal relations you trace in relation to that story, because as you know, the literature is there's a lot of disagreement on this different data sets lead to different conclusions, and different people use different coding, and it's a controversial area, so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Second is this norm around interventionism and so on. I wonder if you could also make the argument that this could be on the decline with the rise of non-traditional powers. It's very interesting how Southeast Asia has seen this massive decline, and these have been the states which tend to be strong states that have resisted external intervention. They have very different kind of notions of sovereignty and human rights and so on. So I wonder, is that norm really in the ascendance, or is it like to decline?
Really good questions. We actually have an entire chapter in the Causes of Peace which deals with the challenges posed by econometric studies on the causes of war and duration of war, because that's looking at causes of peace as well. And it is, I mean, just to give a very, very, very few points. First is that econometric studies tend to deal with slow-changing structural variables. They can't deal with things that change quickly. And so those econometric studies are an implausible explanation of a sudden decline. Because if you look at the relationship between GDP per capita, say, and the risk of war, it is a very, very, it's the single most robust finding that comes out of the literature. Nobody challenges it. What it means is challenged. So for some people, low GDP per capita means low opportunity costs for young males living on the fringes of existence. It's cheap for them to go to war. And others, Jim Fearon and various others, say, no, it's state capacity that really matters. And the greater the capacity of the state, then the less likely there is to be an armed conflict. So what we're actually doing is that when nobody has done any econometric studies on all of the factors that we talk about under the rubric of international activism, whether it's DDR and sanctions and all that. Nobody's done that. There have been econometric studies on peacekeeping, and basically that's it. And I talked to Nick Sambanis at Yale and said, can we pull all of these things together? And he said, no, it's just too hard. There are too many problems with indigeneity and multicollinearity, and it's just, we can't do it. So we said, okay, well, we've looked at this stuff. It helps us in some areas. It's quite useful in terms of looking at changes in structural risks over time. These econometric studies are hopeless, by the way, at prediction. The prediction rate varies between, if you can predict 6% of wars that are going to break out in particular countries, you're doing extremely well. And that's not a great. You can talk about risk, but you can't actually get predictions. So what we decided to do was to say, okay, we've got this big decline. What explains it? And what are all of the alternative explanations that we might? So we didn't think that the structural explanations would work. In other words, declining GDP. We think that declining GDP may have had an impact over 20 years, but it wasn't a sufficiently large one. We went through and looked at all of the other factors, and we've been criticized by Jack Snyder from saying it was really hegemonism. It was American hegemony that permitted this to happen. We sort of said, well, yeah, the Americans didn't go in and try and actively stop it, but that's not the same as causing it. And no matter which way we looked at it, if we looked at the drying up of resources from going to proxy wars at the end of the Cold War, it just didn't explain enough. And we kept on coming back to partly these normative change things, but most particularly these international activism things. And there's a debate going on now in the Cato Institute's Cato Unbound journal, which touches on some of these things. But we don't expect this debate to be over. And the really interesting thing is that apart from several presentations that have been made at conferences, there are no books on this yet. There's two coming out. One by Steve Pinker at Harvard, who doesn't normally write on these things, which is absolutely terrific. And one by Joshua Goldstein, which is also terrific. But we're all essentially saying the same sorts of things.
Yes, over here. And then Pete. Next to Greg. Do you want to have a question?
Oh, sorry. Further to your threats to the risks to the decline, you specifically singled out climate change. I'm wondering what analysis led to that over issues such as perhaps energy security or demography, and what led you to those when there's schools of thought that they may be the next.
Maybe.
But issues such as changing demography and energy security will be the drivers of the conflict in the future rather than climate change, for example.
Well, our report for 2014 is going to be on climate change and security, and I'm not sure we're going to conclude from that yet, so I don't really want to answer your questions, but I mean, the argument that's been in the political science literature and the conflict research literature has been basically about, the idea has been that shrinking resources, and we're talking very, very much drought, water, food production, are going to lead to increased competition and/or out-migration. And if you out-migrate into an area that it isn't as badly off, you're going to come into conflict with people who are also living on the margin of existence, but not quite as badly, and that could lead to.
Sure, sorry, I understand the argument behind climate change, but the argument, for example, China's not going to bother us because it's growing at 9%, that is resource dependent, and there's a chain related to that, and the globalisation that you refer to as strengthening the decreased likelihood of war. If those energy resources are threatened, the same argument applies as people offer for the migrations associated with the need for food, water, etc. Why is that weighted over the example that we've already put China aside because it's going to keep growing, even though that is dependent upon energy security, for example?
Well, I mean, it may well be the case that the Chinese suffer from acute energy shortages, and if they continue to grow at the rate they're growing now, and if the claims are that we're beginning to bump up, I mean, you can argue about peak oil. Everybody agrees that oil is becoming more difficult to extract, but it's really, really, really difficult to find many examples, apart from idiot Saddam Hussein, where countries have actually gone to war for resources for a very, very, very long time. And that's because it's nearly always cheaper, politically as well as economically, to buy them rather than to go to war to seize them. So, I mean, who knows what will happen 20 or 30 years from now. But 20 or 30 years from now, lots of other things are going to have changed as well.
And I'd like to ask a little bit about kind of where you began and where you're going, and as a number of other questions have focused on how you relate to the development people. I think it was while you were still working for Kofi Annan that Kofi Annan himself came out with a paper that I've always thought was very important, called Two Concepts of Sovereignty. And he argued that, you know, we've always focused on state sovereignty. What's really important is the sovereignty of the citizen. And when I have read your work in the past, and when I just glanced at the most recent one, I was wondering whether, you know, you had got that message, because it seemed to me that you were really still talking about states and state sovereignty. But now it seems to me you're not. You're really, like the development people, you're focused on the individual. And obviously you're dealing with the most important thing, that is how people get killed, and how many get killed under what circumstances. But when you say more broadly that you're really focused on organized violence, if we look at the most recent case in Egypt, this amazing several weeks of how the whole population of the country stands up and confronts a repressive government, and so amazing succeeds. If you had asked those people 2 months ago about their human security and organized violence, they would have agreed with you that there have been relatively few battle deaths or deaths over the 30 years of Mubarak in power, but a great deal of violence, organized state-organized violence, which in a sense minimized rather than increased the number of deaths. I mean, people disappeared, people were tortured, so forth and so on. But in terms of your aggregates, this would be a very small blip. Is there some, kind of thinking about what they have done in Egypt and what they've achieved, and what you've been writing about and what you've documented, which is so terribly important? Is there not somehow kind of a linkage from your work into the development people on the positive side in terms of a future notion of human security?
Yeah, great question. And the first book I worked on was called War Without Weapons. It was about non-violence in national defense, and it was also about non-violence. And the really interesting thing about that, I think, is that, and I mentioned this previously, if you look at how that huge decline in authoritarian regimes has come about, it has mostly not come about as a consequence of violent struggle. It's mostly, very occasionally it's come about because, as in the case of Panama, the Americans intervened, they just chucked a guy out. Grenada, I think, is the same. But those are the exceptions. The rule is sometimes the regime just agrees to change over a long period of time, and sometimes you have these popular uprisings. And Jan Galtung, I think, had a very, very interesting insight when he said that as societies become more complex and more interdependent, they're increasingly difficult to govern by brute repression. You've seen that in the Middle East. The form of repression is widespread in the Middle East, but the form has changed. You think back to 1982, when the Syrians were confronted by Muslim Brotherhood, sort of uprising in the town of Hama. They went in and killed, we don't know, maybe 100,000, a huge number. Saddam Hussein in the Anfal campaign against the Kurds, killed 100,000, just like that. That sort of repression doesn't take place to anything like the same degree in the Middle East today. It's been much more focused, much more targeted on individuals, etc., because I think of a recognition that if you're going to govern reasonably effectively, you have to have a degree of cooperation from the citizens. And if citizens withdraw that cooperation, then you simply can't survive. To give you an example, in 1974, the Ulster Workers' Council went on strike. This is the Protestants in the north. And they paralysed everything. They stopped the trains, they stopped electricity, just about every public service stopped. And the British government called in the army and said, look, we want you guys to do what you did in the Great Strike last time, go in and run everything. And a week later, the army guys came back and said, sorry, we can't, it's too complicated, we don't know how to do it. In other words, and nobody looked at this because these were reactionaries. So it wasn't one of those things that the non-violent people took up. But here was a case where a relatively small group had completely paralysed the state because of non-violent direct action from stopping everything to work. And I don't know if you remember that in Egypt, once there was the talk of strikes where doctors and other people were going on strikes, that was one of the points in which there was a shift. So I am very optimistic about that. I'm particularly optimistic because there's a contagion effect that's going on there as well. Now, of course, from our point of view, previously there was not a great deal of violence in that part of the Middle East, Tunisia, and like that, in terms of numbers of people getting killed. And now there's no change. So our data sets aren't going to cover that. But one of the things we are going to be looking at is, at some point in the future, is how do you get rid of repressive regimes? Another question is, why do repressive regimes so often give up, even though they have the capacity to slaughter huge numbers of people and probably to be able to reimpose their rule? A really interesting article in Foreign Policy recently on how it's the case that life has become tougher for dictators. It used to be the case, I mentioned Idi Amin, went to Saudi Arabia. Previously, these dictators would go off, they'd find a particular country, south of France, whatever it is, they'd take their few $1 billion, they'd live happily ever after. Now people are coming after them. And there have been something like, I think, 120 successful senior officials for precisely this sort of thing. So there's a deterrence thing in there. There is the contagion effect. If non-violence works, then people will pick it up and try it somewhere else. And it's way, way more effective than civil wars against these sorts of states.
Any final questions or comments? No? Well, we're out of time anyway. But thank you very much for your